we are continuing to read the Message of Godhead by His Divine Grace Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. We're on page number 15. Just like Arjuna, the Prime Minister under Nawab Hussain Shah of Bengal, namely Sakar Malik, who was later known as Sanatana Goswami, one of the chief disciples of Lord Chaitanya, represented himself as a materialistic fool before Lord Chaitanya when he met the Lord at Benares. He presented his case before Lord Chaitanya as follows: Ordinary persons, those who have no knowledge of transcendence, address me as a great leader, a great scholar, a Mahatma, a Paramahamsa, and so on. But I am doubtful whether I am really so. They may be insulting me indirectly by calling me something that I am not. I know that I have no knowledge about myself as I am, but still materialistic fools address me as learned. This is undoubtedly a joke and an insult." Unquote. With these words, Srila Sanatana Goswami presented his case. In fact, at the same time, he really was learned in transcendental knowledge, but he presented to be a materialistic fool like us. Srila Sanatana Goswami criticized himself for allowing others to call him a great leader or erudite scholar when he had no transcendental knowledge. Indirectly, he asserted that there is no greater materialistic fool than one who advertises himself and collects the cheap votes of similar fools to gain fame as a great scholar, great leader, great philosopher, great Mahatma, or great Paramahamsa, all without any knowledge of his real self, the spirit soul, and without offering any benefit to the soul proper, simply wasting time in the matter of happiness and distress of the temporary material body and mind. Sanatana means eternal. Thus, Sanatana Goswami was interested in the eternal happiness of the living entities, not just the temporary happiness of their temporary bodies and minds. When one thus becomes interested in the permanent happiness of the permanent soul, he becomes a disciple of Sanatana Goswami, or a real Sanatanist, that is, a transcendentalist. Throughout the world, at the present moment, almost all leaders, scholars, and Mahatmas are more or less materialists, without any taste for transcendental knowledge. Thus, Sri Krishna, the personality of Godhead, at first rebuked Arjuna and refused to accept him as a pandita or scholar, with a view to teach the so-called learned scholars and leaders who are really materialistic fools. Almost all present-day leaders have popularized various modes of religiosity that have to do only with the material body and mind. But very few of them know that the body and mind are only the outer coat and shirt of the soul proper. Simply by taking care of the outer coat and shirt, one cannot do any good to the real self, the soul. Factually, the soul is the chief interest. No sane man would look after the interest of the outer paraphernalia while overlooking the chief interest, his very interest, his very self. If he looks after the needs of his chief interest, then his subordinate interests, his material body and mind, are looked after automatically. But no one can serve the chief simply by serving the subordinates. In other words, it is not possible to satisfy one's inner hunger simply by carefully tending one's outer clothing. So when we speak of a living entity, we must see the body and the mind as two outer coverings, two layers of paraphernalia. When we see the living force or spirit soul as the chief, central figure. The outer coverings are temporary arrangements, and therefore everything dependent on the outer covering is also a temporary arrangement. Happiness and distress perceived in relation with the temporary arrangement of the body and mind are also temporary. Thus, in Bhagavad Gita, the personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna says, O son of Kunti, all forms of happiness and distress, such as winter, cold, or summer heat, are due to material sense perception only. They come and go according to the laws of nature, and they are therefore to be tolerated without being disturbed. One who is not disturbed by all these comings and goings of temporary happiness and distress, he alone becomes a fit person to attain eternal life. But at the present stage of our existence, it is difficult to be unaffected by the temporary happiness and distress pertaining to the body and mind. Nor is it possible at present to assert that we are unidentified with the body and mind. Thus, acquiring transcendental knowledge does not mean that we become indifferent to our present state of affairs. It means that we should not be overwhelmed by the comings and goings of happiness and distress. We must know the nature of these temporary states of material happiness and distress. It would be sheer stupidity to ignore them. It would be sheer stupidity to ignore them, as it would be to remain indifferent in matters concerning the spirit soul, on the basis of which the material body and mind exist. Still, if a person is fortunate enough to understand the spirit soul and to get a taste for transcendental knowledge, then even in the midst of worldly happiness and distress which pertains to the body and mind, he will remain indifferent and relish transcendental peace. Real peace can be obtained only in the transcendental stage of existence. That is the stage of real contentment. If after a long time away from home somebody embarks on a homeward journey, the pleasure of being homeward bound diminishes the accompanying distress of the journey. The inconveniences of traveling become subordinate to the pleasure of heading homeward. Similarly, for one who is headed back home, back to Godhead, by dint of transcendental knowledge, the material miseries of the body and mind are insignificant. Oh, this is so beautiful. Isn't it? Like, all of you have this experience, I'm sure, that, when you're going somewhere, the journey seems so long, but when you're coming back home, the journey is like super quick. So we're going back home, back to Godhead, and material miseries of body and mind are insignificant. Wow, this is beautiful. Okay, sense perception is the cause of feeling all sorts of happiness and distress. Form, taste, odor, sound, and touch are different sense perceptions which render happiness or distress in cooperation with the mind. In winter, bathing in cold water gives us pain, but in summer, the same cold water gives us pleasure. In winter, fire gives us pleasure and warmth, but in summer, the same fire gives us distress. Thus, neither fire nor water has any intrinsic power to give us happiness or distress, but they appear to us as agents of happiness or distress according to our mode of sense perception in various circumstances. Therefore, nothing that exists in the world is either an object of happiness or an object of distress. Rather, happiness and distress are simply subjective, that is, dependent on our sense perceptions as they relate to our internal process of thinking, feeling, and willing. But such temporary sensations of happiness and distress pertaining to the acts of thinking, feeling, and willing under a false ego are eternally different, from the spirit soul and are therefore unreal reality, in quotes. Unreal reality. Thus, whatever advancement of knowledge mundane scholars have made, whether in art or science, if that knowledge is without reference to the eternal spirit soul, it is but a manifestation of the illusory modes of nature that encompass and limit the material body and mind. Real peace and happiness can never come about through such advancement of materialistic knowledge. Rather, as Sri Krishna, the personality of Godhead, confirms in the Bhagavad Gita, only those who cultivate transcendental knowledge in relation to the eternal spirit soul and without being disturbed by temporary happiness and distress will be able to escape the cruel hands of birth, death, old age, and disease, and become truly happy by regaining their eternal spiritual life. We therefore suggest that all those who have tried their utmost to do good for others but have failed despite all honest endeavors should approach Sri Krishna or his bona fide servitors, following the footsteps of Arjuna. One should try to do good for others, but only after knowing perfectly how to do good for others. Otherwise, if one embraces the interests of others out of a false sense of altruism, one can get only a temporary benefit for himself in the shape of some profit, adoration, or distinction. A Hitler, a Mussolini, or any other leader of that materialistic persuasion may offer his followers the mental concoction of doing good together in violent or non-violent programs, and by such acts of so-called benevolence, the leader may get recognition from his followers for some time. But the followers for whom this kind of leader has endeavored to do good will never get any lasting benefit out of such temporary beneficial work. A void will be felt with the progress of all such benevolent activities. This is so true! Yeah. In fact, the followers will be put into more and more distress by following the path chalked out by this kind of so-called leader. If a blind man pretends to help another blind man cross a road, then both the blind leader and the blind follower shall fall into the further darkness of some unseen ditch. One who is devoid of transcendental knowledge is just like a blind man. Such a blind man must first eradicate his blindness before he can attempt to lead others to light. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and the link to this beautiful book is in the description. Please check it out, and we will see you next time. Hare Krishna!